I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behaviour Speak.
Over, 10 million people died. And when we think about these numbers, that's a pretty significant chunk of the population. So there were some families that were separated and would never see each other again. And there was a lot of violence, especially gendered violence. Rape was used as a war tactic. Children were shot in front of their parents. There were trains of migrants that were burned alive, shot, buses burned. There were railway platforms covered in blood and body parts. And so those images have really cemented themselves into the psyche of our people. And yet there was also this sense of, well, we must go on. We must go on. And there's, culturally speaking, there's a lot of stoicism in South Asian culture. And so people didn't talk about it because they had to deal with what was happening now, right? If you're a migrant family and you have young children to feed, you can't really process your grief around losing your homeland and your parents and siblings because you have to find work in this new land and people are trying to figure out how to make the most of their resources. So there's a lot of pain, a lot of shame, a lot of stigma, a lot of silence around this topic. But I also recognize that people have, just like trauma has been passed down, resiliency, courage, strength is also passed down. And a lot of those folks are really trying to bring the language to talk about this because in a lot of South Asian language, we don't have the words to describe things like anxiety and depression. We don't have the words to discuss trauma. So how do you talk about something?
Yeah.
There are no words to describe it, to name it.
Today on Behaviour Speak, we're diving into one of the most influential and least talked about events of the modern world, 1847 Partition of South Asia, and the intergenerational trauma it left behind. I'm joined by Dr. Ammara Khalid, a South Asian psychologist, writer, and researcher whose work focuses on trauma, migration, and mental health through a decolonial lens. Drawing from both her clinical practice and her own family's history of partition, Dr. Khalid helps us understand how trauma can be passed down through generations, even through silence. We talk about the largest mass migration in history, why so many stories of partition were never spoken aloud, how trauma shows up in the body and in families decades later, and why Western mental health frameworks often fall short for South Asian communities. Dr. Khalid also shares insights from her upcoming book, The South Asian Guide to Breaking the Cycle of Trauma, and offers compassionate, culturally grounded ways to begin healing through curiosity, narrative, community, and reconnection with ancestral practices. This is a powerful, emotional conversation about memory, migration, resilience, and what it really means to break cycles, not by rejecting our history, but by honoring it. Let's get into it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks again for coming on. I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. For listeners who, maybe we could start by just talking a bit about the partition and kind of what it means. For listeners who might not be familiar, can you explain what the partition of South Asia, why it remains such a significant historical event?
Yeah, the partition of 1947 in the Indian subcontinent between Pakistan and India was the largest mass migration in our world's history. It took place very quickly with people being ill-informed about how things were going to go. People left their homes thinking that they were going to be able to go back, retrieve their belongings, see their family members. And, we know that wasn't the case. And once the borders were closed, they were closed. But historically, it's been a lot of activity since the 1600s in the Indian subcontinent. The British arrived. Before that, we had, Napoleon, Alexander come through. But really, when the British arrived, that's when we started to see a lot of the clashes. At this time, the Mughal era was ending, and there were several regions that were part of the Indian subcontinent. So it wasn't what we just see today as modern-day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Burma was part of the Indian subcontinent. Some of the Arab states were part of it, UAE, Qatar, Oman, Yemen.
Wow.
Some of those regions were annexed early on. Burma in 1937, the Arabic states around the 40s and 50s. So, during World War II, really it was the partition of Pakistan and India that took place in 1947. And then the Liberation War of 1971 is when East Pakistan and West Pakistan became Pakistan and Bangladesh. So those were pretty major events, significant events that a lot of South Asians don't really know much about because that generation has passed, or people know about it. Not a lot of stories have survived from that time. And that's one of the things that I'm really trying to bring forward in my book is the stories. There are several projects like the 1947 Archive Project, Citizens Archive Project, the Partition Museum, that are trying to gather these stories. They're collecting oral histories from survivors and witnesses of the partition. And what my book does is takes it forward into the children and grandchildren of those folks to get a sense of how some of these traumas can be passed on intergenerationally. So it can be through our genetics, it can be through family narratives, it can be through various different kinds of dynamics. It can also be passed down through silence.
You've told me so much already I didn't know. We think about intergenerational trauma. This goes well beyond 1947, and so this goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I've learned a lot about, in the last few years about anti-Black racism and slavery and that whole history, and everything goes back to the British and those early days of colonization. I had no idea that all these countries were part of one large subcontinent, nation. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and very wealthy region. One of the highest GDPs. We were really doing well in a lot of ways. People feel very mixed about the partition. They have very mixed feelings about being colonized, even, I would say. Some people say the partition never should have happened. Others feel that it was inevitable. People feel like their sacrifices were worth it and feel very patriotic about their nation. But we haven't recovered, and we can see this right now based on what's happening in the region. There's a lot of Hindu-Muslim clashes in India. Saw, an attack on Kashmir last spring in 2025. So there's constant threats that are being hurled by either side of the border. Pakistan and Bangladesh are continuing to see a lot of upheaval, political upheaval. We're grappling with fascism in India. Minorities are continuing to suffer. And there were plenty of people, especially in some of the elite class, were unscathed. But a lot of people suffered with what happened throughout history. There were natural disasters, there were floods, famines, war, displacement. And what we know from studies on intergenerational trauma in other places like the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the war in Cambodia, the Holocaust, we know that these traumas can be passed even if the future descendants don't necessarily know what happened or don't have the story of what happened. And I think that with the partition in itself, the goal was to have it done very quickly, and there was not sort of the thoughtful process that went into creating the Canadian-American border or the New Zealand-Australian border. It happened very quickly. People didn't have time to process what was happening, to know, what was going to happen to land, rivers, army, currency. Even books in the local libraries were being, hurled back and forth. Who's going to take A to Z, A to J encyclopedia? Who's getting the rest? Animals, zoo animals being divided. It was so tragic. And for me, it's a very personal story because both sides of my grandparents went through the partition. They moved from India into present-day Pakistan. I'm very, very fortunate that I've been able to hear their stories and speak to them about those experiences. And being in the field of psychology, really being able to look at my own family and see how that trauma was passed down to my parents' generation and their siblings, and then me and my siblings, my cousins, and how we're trying to break those cycles for our children and generations to come.
You already described it as the largest mass migration in modern history. Can you just talk a little bit more about what exactly was happening? Like, why in 1947 did this mass migration what was sort of the decisions behind this, and why was it so rapid?
Some of it can be attributed to the divide and conquer strategy that the British had. And so there were a lot of clashes between Hindus and Muslims in the area. There was a lot of lawlessness that they were trying to address, and the British were trying to leave the colonies. So the Labour Party was acting quickly as competition for power, for land was on the up and up, and they drew up maps with these borders without much thought given to the history of the independent kingdoms and British-owned India. The kingdoms and the territories merged and lost their freedoms and formed these two countries, India and Pakistan. And so people really just overheard on the radio, okay, this is happening tomorrow. All the Muslims need to leave and go to Pakistan. This is how. And so you have about over 14 million people that were impacted. Hundreds and thousands were displaced, living in refugee camps. Over, 10 million people died. And when we think about these numbers, that's a pretty significant chunk of the population. So there were some families that were separated and would never see each other again. And there was a lot of violence, especially gendered violence. Rape was used as a war tactic. Children were shot in front of their parents. There were trains of migrants that were burned alive, shot. Buses burned. There were railway platforms covered in blood and body parts. Those images have really cemented themselves into the psyche of our people. And yet there was also this sense of, well, we must go on. We must go on. And there's, culturally speaking, there's a lot of stoicism in South Asian culture. And so people didn't talk about it because they had to deal with what was happening now, right? If you're a migrant family and you have young children to feed, you can't really process your grief around losing your homeland and your parents and siblings because you have to find work in this new land, and people are trying to figure out how to make the most of their resources. So there's a lot of pain, a lot of shame, a lot of stigma, a lot of silence. But I also recognize that people, just like trauma has been passed down, resiliency, courage is also passed down. And a lot of those folks are really trying to bring the language to talk about this, because in a lot of South Asian language, we don't have the words to describe things like anxiety and depression. We don't have the words to discuss trauma. So how do you talk about something when there are no words to describe it?
Yeah, thinking about your point about the silence, why do you think so many people outside of South Asia, maybe even South Asians, know so little about it?
I think because there was so much happening globally with World War II, and traditionally, we have not been well researched in a lot of different ways when it comes to history, politics, genetics. And now that so much of our population is educated, we're saying, hey, we matter too. Our history also deserves attention. Our research, our tools, our language, our dance, our poetry, right? A lot of things have been culturally appropriated without really giving much thought to what is the history behind it. Whether it's yoga, whether it's music, whether it's so many things that have just been extrapolated from that subcontinent. So I think there's, and there's a generation of folks like the millennials, the Gen Z, that are thinking about things like identity, like belonging, and recognizing now that we have some of the language for mental health issues, how do we relate this to our history? How do we see it in the context of our grandparents and our parents and ourselves?
With so many families experiencing extreme violence and separation and forced migration during the partition, how did people survive in the immediate aftermath, psychologically and emotionally?
I think a lot of people survive through their community connections, through shared resources, with the help of other people. With all the massacres going on, I can tell you some incredible stories about people who were, Hindus and hiding Muslim families in their homes and waited until dark to let them cross the border, or Muslim families who hid Sikh families in their home. There were a lot of people who would, take their belongings under their blankets and things like that, help each neighbors, right? And my grandmother, I used to talk about how she would attend Diwali celebrations, or,
Hmm.
there was a sense of cultural exchange that really was very jarring for a lot of people, because
Hmm.
all of a sudden you're expected to hate your neighbor. You're expected to hate the people that you've grown up, that you've, shared food with and broken bread with.
Hmm.
Well, the violence actually didn't happen within neighborhoods. You would go fight the neighbor who was in a separate village, who you didn't really know, because you didn't want to have that experience with these people that you already had relationships with. The army, of course, using rape as a war tactic. You saw this especially in Bangladesh in
Hmm.
1971. The Pakistani army raped a lot of Bengali women. There's been a long-standing history of gendered violence in the South Asian community, and there's a lot of silence around that as well, whether it's domestic violence or intimate partner violence, sexual abuse. So a lot of people grow up in abusive households, or, with these parents that were just trying to survive and feed their families, but suffering from hypervigilance, suffering from scarcity mindset, from acute stress, post-traumatic stress.
Hmm.
And then you see that sort of trickle into addictions, or you see that become, patterns of abuse in families. So it's a lot that I'm trying to cover in this book, and bring attention to, and just, like I said, find ways to talk about it, name it, and then figure out how do you heal from it.
Tell me a little bit more about the book. What's it called? What you kind of cover in there?
So the book is called The South Asian Guide to Healing, Breaking the Cycle of Trauma. It's coming out in 2027, and it's being published by Jessica Kingsley Book. I had no intention of writing a book. I just wanted to do some research, because as a family therapist, I see a lot of families, including multi-generational families. I'll say, hey, let's bring everyone into the therapy room, grandma, grandpa, whoever it is, let's look at the family dynamics. And so I was looking at research on intergenerational trauma in South Asians, and I couldn't find anything. And I
Hmm.
said, okay, well, I guess I start writing this, and my hope is that other people will follow suit and write about it. I've spoken to folks who have done this work in collecting oral histories from everywhere, from Kabul to Burma, and everyone in between. And you'll find so much diversity in these stories. It's not always about trauma. It's about resilience and courage and community ships. And, a lot of people talk, from a very nostalgic place of
Hmm.
being together with these different neighbors that they had. And, my grandparents who, weren't able to go back. And some of their family actually stayed behind in India. And these are people that I will never be able to go see unless they
Hmm.
change the border policies, because as a Pakistani citizen, um, I'm not really allowed to go to India and see Lucknow.
Hmm.
My grandparents are from, and I've heard about their house, and I've heard about the neighbors and the family that lives there, but I wouldn't really be able to go back there and physically see it myself. And so it also brings up this question, where do I really come? Do I come from Pakistan? Come from India? From the larger
Hmm.
sort of Indus Valley civilization? And
Hmm.
our South Asian region is so diverse, and you have Hyderabadi culture, you have Bihari culture, you have Rajasthan, Punjabi, Sindhi, so many different groups. South India is so diverse, North India is so diverse. A lot of times the research that's presented sort of just mushes everyone together, not
Hmm.
recognizing that different regions have different languages, different poetry,
Hmm.
different
Hmm.
customs, different food. It's a very unique population to talk about, given all of the different influences that we had from Central Asia, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, South India. So there's a lot of different influences and different groups that make up South Asians.
Yeah. I didn't realize that even today you you can't go into India as Pakistani. Has it been like that since the partition?
Pretty much. And, sometimes it depends on who you know. And
Hmm.
obviously, for diplomatic purposes, people are able to go. But, in the 90s, there was a big push to, create some goodwill between the two countries. And I remember
Hmm.
that Some of my friends started this initiative called Youth Initiative for Peace. And the idea was to bring students, school-going students there, and have them bring their history books so we could sort of compare notes. And those history books were completely different. The Indian history, studying Indian history books were just so, it was laughable, right? Because so much of history has been written and rewritten. And so it's hard to even know, well, what is the truth? Because depending on who you talk to, you get a very different version. We have been fed a lot of lies about the other person or the other party or the other group. So it's really important to sort of be curious. And I think that, the Indians and Pakistanis I've spoken to who have crossed the border have talked about how welcome they felt. And people that have been able to go and see their old homes, the current people living there have celebrated them, welcomed them with open arms and said, look, yeah, we kept this thing from your great grandmother, or we have this thing from your grandfather that he left behind. There's this sense of grief and loss that doesn't get spoken about because, they're two nuclear countries that are constantly at war with each other. That sentiment gets lost.
And silence, it does seem to play a powerful role here. How do you understand silence in the context of the partition-related?
I think silence, especially when it comes to talking about emotional issues, is pretty prevalent in our communities because the idea is that you go, fulfill your duties as a parent, you make sure your children are educated, you provide food, you provide shelter. Historically, from those previous generations, which is true for any previous generation, there wasn't a lot of emotional literacy, right? There wasn't a lot of focus on attuning to children or what emotional presence means. So when you are coming from that state of survival, you're focusing on surviving, not thriving. And you don't really have language or time or the internal capacity to be able to talk about emotions, to talk about grief and loss. And for a lot of people, they found comfort in their religious or spiritual practices, turning towards, whether it's Muslim, Sikh, just practices, going to the mosque, the temple, the Gurdwara, and finding solace there. Because sometimes being emotional or having mental health struggles can be seen as a sign of personal weakness. It becomes about, well, you're not doing enough to pull yourself out of it. You need to focus on other things. And so there's no room, really, no space to have some of these conversations. And sometimes the pain was so much that people just shut down and they could not bring themselves to talk about what they saw, what they lost. So some things were secret. People had children that they no longer talked about because they had died during the partition. And it wouldn't be until, many, many years later that someone discovered, oh, there was this family member that died and nobody talks about him.
Wow.
Or there were, so-and-so sisters that, jumped into wells because they didn't want to be raped. And that's how they died. So there's a lot of, heavy themes around grief and loss that people have not been able to bring themselves to talk about.
Yeah. The silence is really sometimes a protective factor for folks.
It is.
How does respect for elders and cultural values?
So I think respect for elders, patriarchy, these are kind of the larger themes that govern a lot of South Asian households.
Yeah.
What we do know is that when we approach our elders, it has to be with, the respect and curiosity. I was very fortunate in that, my maternal grandparents, especially, were fairly open about what they experienced. But I know in some families, you really can't push for information because if the adult has said, I'm not talking about this, you have to respect that boundary. So you have to be creative sometimes in how you approach asking family members for information. Maybe you don't go directly to that person. Maybe you go to their cousin, an aunt, or an uncle, or somebody else. I think one of the most beautiful things about South Asian family is the large extended family network that we have. And so there are other people that are there to fill in the gaps. if you don't have that relationship with your own parents or with your own grandparents. But, we have a lot of respect for our elders, and it's hard to challenge them. It's hard to push back. And I think there are naturally generational differences in any group, given sort of the hierarchical structure in South Asian families, especially how much patriarchy plays a role, as head of the households. Even if there may be a younger brother, he may have more power and authority in a family than the sisters and things like that. So there's a lot of gendered roles and rules and expectations that we're expected to follow. And I do think we're seeing an evolution in that. And, things are changing. There's more egalitarian relationship, especially between husbands and wives, which are then changing and shifting some of the family dynamics that we see in more traditional conservative house.
A little bit more on the silence, because you talked a lot about sort of the heaviness and the heavy emotions and stories that weren't being shared. How do you help clients make sense of these emotions that are tied to these histories that were never taught?
So I'll give you an example. I was working with a client from Bangladesh who was an international student here and, was struggling that first year with homesickness. And I could relate because I was an international student in the US too, once upon a time myself. So we talked about how much he missed his mother's home cooked meals and missed his sisters. He talked a little bit about, knowing that his grandparents had migrated from West Pakistan at some point into India and then from India to Bangladesh, but he didn't really know details. But he had come to see me because he was really struggling with insomnia. And you could see the bags under his eyes. He was very sweet, but just really tired. His grades were suffering. There was a lot of anxiety and depression. And he had a recurring nightmare where he talked about being in this loud, noisy airport. And he knows that he has to get to his flight. They're announcing his flight. But he sees a cologne bottle in one of those duty-free shops with the words Exodus written on it. He doesn't know what it means, and he keeps staring at this bottle, and it has like a pull over him, and he's not sure what to make, but he knows that he needs to leave, and he wakes up. And we talked about this dream, and we talked about the word Exodus, and we looked it up together because he really didn't know what it meant. And it refers to the migration of Moses, and, it refers to the biblical and the Old Testament. And so we wondered, where did that come from? I started to ask him questions. I said, since your family did migrate, do you know anything about that? And he said, I don't. And he actually went back and started to ask some questions to his mom because his grandparents had already passed. But turned out that his grandfather had been rushing to get to one of the last trains that was leaving from Pakistan. And because he had young children, he wasn't able to get there on time. So the grandfather's older brother had already boarded the train with the family. And there were no survivors on this train. Nobody survived that. And had his grandfather been on that train, would not have survived. But he was delayed. He was held back. And so we talked about the significance of this dream. And we talked about how sometimes these family secrets, even though we don't know about them, they're manifesting in these symptoms. They're manifesting in our bodies, our anxiety. We may go around in our day-to-day thinking, well, we have everything we need. I don't lacking anything. So then why am I not happy? Or why do I feel so anxious? Or why do I feel like what I have isn't enough? And there's never enough. So that's where some of these things can be uncovered. And so we talked about how, the anxiety and depression that he was experiencing was layered, not just because of his own experience of being away from his own family, but there was this whole history that he didn't even know about.
Yeah, this sort of felt trauma versus remembered trauma. What role does curiosity and compassion play in this whole process?
Very, very major roles. If there are folks who are interested in talking to their family members, but don't know where to start. Being curious, that's something that my book really highlights, is how to approach folks with these questions, because you don't know what level of trauma they experience. You don't know, what may come up for them if they're recounting some of these stories.
Mm,
So to the non-judgmental space is really key.
mm,
And recognize that some people may have details to share, other people will not, especially for those who have grandparents in their 80s and 90s. There may be some dementia, some memory loss. So it's hard to figure out, well, what's fact and what's post memory versus what's actually being remembered, what's a flashbulb memory.
mm,
So pushing them with curiosity, compassion, not pushing for details, especially
mm,
for a lot of folks who just get tired, after recounting some of these things. And you can get information, you can get it from other stories, other collections of history. And if there are gaps and you don't know what happened, you can still find ways to. One of the things I really recommend is writing a letter to your ancestors. What
mm.
would you want them to know? What do you think
Love
their
that.
wishes were for you? I think a lot of us are our ancestors' wildest dreams, and
Mm,
celebrate that. And let's come to our families with that compassion, because right now, for example, you'll see this all over social media. Family estrangement is a hot topic. What are the pros and cons of cutting ties? And what are the pros and cons of establishing these boundaries? Boundaries gets a very bad rep in South Asian families. There's a way to do boundaries. There's a way to do it with compassion. It doesn't have to be in that same sort of Western framework. And this is why decolonizing mental health is so important, because we have to understand the role of context when we're applying some of these principles, these frameworks to South Asian mental health. Everything translates equally. And so having compassion, recognizing that, yes, a lot of our parents and parents made major mistakes and they were trying to do the best that they could. And being able to hold that dialectic, recognize that two things can be true at once, is a practice, and it takes time, and it takes compassion, not just for our families, but I think also for ourselves. And when we start to practice self-compassion, you have room for compassion for others. But if you are constantly berating yourself for not being good enough, or coming down harshly with self-criticism and judgment, you manifest that across your relationships as well.
When you might have some of your own biases here, how do you avoid forcing narratives where information is missing?
So one of the cool things about the 1947 archive is that they've created sort of a questionnaire, a template. I
Mm,
use something similar in my work, and it has a series of questions that you ask, and you can get training as well on, if you are interested in collecting oral histories. There's a training process you go through that
mm,
teaches you, how to navigate some of these difficult topics, especially when someone is disclosing something like being raped or domestic violence or sexual abuse, to have, because that requires a little bit of training and sensitivity. So
mm,
some sense of how to navigate those conversations. It's important not to push someone to talking about something when they're really not comfortable sharing, and to be able to provide resources. Like, if you need to talk to somebody about this, here are some resources. Now, a lot of elders in the South Asian community don't even believe in therapy, right? They don't
mm,
want to speak to a stranger. That doesn't make sense to them. For a long time, therapy would happen in mosques or mandirs
mm,
or different temples, or within families. You had, family members that you could go to, or that person in your village that was kind of recognized as the wise advice. But we don't have that. We've become disconnected in our communities. There's
mm,
urbanization and modernization, and people just don't have time to invest in those relationships like they used to. And so when you don't have that community support, it becomes very isolating, because then who do you talk to? Especially if you're so uncomfortable with the idea of seeking mental health uh, professional help. And sometimes it's not even about your own reservation. Sometimes it's just access. There's no therapist in your village, or when you're in town,
mm,
nobody that you can talk to. A lot of people that I speak to in India and Pakistan are concerned about privacy. There's not enough regulation. So what happens if confidentiality is broken? You see the
mm,
person in other settings? How do you navigate multiple relationships? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of help people understand how to have effective mental health professionals in South Asian communities. I'm hopeful. I see it happening, and I'm hopeful that it will come about.
Yeah. Your point about even having a family come into the office, and I'm trying to think about, you mentioned decolonization of mental health, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on what decolonizing mental health looks from that kind of Indian cultural lens. I hear a lot about the comparison. I hear a lot about this in sort of Black psychology and indigenous psychology and sort of these Western approaches. What does that look like in an Indian context?
So a lot of my training, for example, is on Western populations, and a lot of the theories and frameworks that have been developed for Western families, not necessarily collectivist South Asian families. So the idea of having independence and autonomy in a Western family may look very different in a collectivist South Asian family, that, parent and children are enmeshed necessarily when you think about what is the cultural norm. And so sometimes when people are talking about, oh, this is what the culture says, I pause and I'm like, is this the culture, or is this the culture of your family? Because the two are not always the same. And this is very true for immigrant families, especially parents who immigrated in the 60s, 70s, 80s. They're kind of stuck in that era of whatever they left behind. And they don't realize that things have moved forward back home, wherever home is. So tell their children about cultural values, which may or may not be outdated. So decolonizing mental health for me looks like, I've had, for example, I see a lot of couples in my practice. And sometimes we get to a place where things are good between the couple. Now we need to bring in one of the in-laws because it's a different relationship that's impacting. And I think a lot of, Western trained psychologists may kind of shy away from that. Like, oh, that needs to be, a different person or something. For me, it's really about, I am treating the system and I'm treating relationships, right? Not individual clients. And so if the relationship is my client, how can I help foster more closeness, connection through good communication? Where can we set those boundaries, right? Do they have to be so harsh, or can there be softer boundaries? Or can you still do what you need to do without necessarily announcing it to everybody? It's my boundary and it must be followed, right? So there are different ways of using tact and softer language to practice healthy boundaries or healthy communication.
Yeah. Just continuing on this tangent for a second about decolonization, I'm curious about, because you talked about having a lot of Western training and Westernized training in psychology. Again, when I speak to a lot of the Indigenous guests that have had the podcast, they talk about the lack of opportunity for Indigenous mentorship, for sort of training and Indigenous sort of, what does, I guess, kind of a multiple part, are there a lot of Indian psychologists? What does sort of representation of sort of Indian values and approaches look like in training? And I think for professionals, we have a lot of professionals that are listening, psychologists that are listening. I'm sure many of them are going to be looking forward to your book in 27. And sort of to your point, there's not a lot of research out there. What does sort of culturally responsive training and can it look like?
There's the stereotype about how many South Asians go into medicine and become doctors, right?
Yeah.
Not a lot of them go into the field of psychology and psychiatry, which I think in the last 30 years or so has significantly changed, but we're still pretty behind. So there's not a lot of us that are doing this work. However, what we see is that when we bring in a decolonial approach, that means not using the same interventions that we may have learned in graduate school. For example, I may do workshops in the community, because initially when I started my practice, I was thrilled. I said, look, this is great. I speak Urdu and Hindi. Where are my people, right? And I have this nice office on Michigan Avenue. No one's coming to see me there, though, because I was not familiar with the folks that I wanted to bring in. So I started to go to the mosque, go to the temple, did workshops so that I could show people what a therapist or a psychologist looks like and sounds like, and using language that, they were able to understand, giving examples in cultural context that they were able to resonate with, and recognizing that, hey, if you want to include your imam or your guru or whoever, your spiritual advisor in a session, we do that. We can make those bridges because those are important networks in your support system. Or, for example, being in other modes of healing. I recognize that it has less. So maybe we incorporate, your prayers, or maybe we incorporate music and dance from your culture and use the tools that you already have that are part of your ancestral healing. Use it in a way that resonates more for you than some intervention that's been adopted for a Western society and Western family.
Yeah.
It requires us to be really educated, first and foremost, of our South Asian, right? What do they look like? A lot of that is rooted in religious practices, but a lot of that is through drum circles and music and dance and cooking and food and bringing people together for different things. So recognizing the power and the sense of community that we have as South Asians, and creating those connections that help our mental health, I think, can go a really long way.
I love that. As an aside, a good friend of mine just finished his dissertation on using the sitar and the raga in music therapy and sort of the power of that. And yeah, really neat.
I have a background in music, actually.
Oh, yes?
Yeah, I grew up singing on stage. I studied classical music in Pakistan. I studied Kathak, which is a classical form of dance. And, I've used that in session. I used to write my own songs, and I've done songwriting with some clients.
Wow.
I think music has such tremendous healing capacity.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about traumas that are stored in the body, or that were stored in at a time where there was no language, right? When you were pre-verbal, how do you release that? You don't release that through words. You have to find other ways to release it. And sometimes that is through movement, that is through song, that is through all of these different tools that we can use.
And it kind of it makes me wonder about, because when we think about a lot of these cultures that have been experiencing sort of living in colonization for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, often the history that we learn about these countries is only their time, and without, going too far off base. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about sort of what resilience and preventative practices and mental health look like kind of in pre-colonial India, and how that kind of might be, and I think we talked about it already with the music and arts and whatnot, be brought into sort of modern therapy.
Yeah, therapy in itself is not a Western. It's been around since the dawn of mankind, and it has looked very different throughout our history. If you look at Islamic history, for example, you will find that there were, they were treating mental health issues at 1,400 years ago. There were places where you would go for help and healing. There's Hindu history, there's Sikh history, there's a lot of history around, religious interventions that helped those in need or took care of folks who didn't have the cognitive capacity to take care of themselves. And then just the larger community, right? People would come together as a village, in families to, help the person and create space for that. So that, I think, is part of the history. Now I think there's sort of a push dynamic between, obviously depending on which socioeconomic status you belong to, and there's a wide disparity in South Asia. You may or may not have access to resources. You may or may not have access to mental health professionals. And, even just this last December when I was visiting Pakistan, I was able to talk to therapists there who are doing this work and talking about
Hmm.
how they're having to reach into the community to create a system, because it's not, therapy cannot just happen in some nice office with soft couches and sage pillows, right? In the community. And part of that is training folks in the community on how to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Even if there is nothing like a national suicide hotline or domestic violence how can you designate people to go into the community, do this work,
Hmm.
and then come back and then have their work supported. It's community based. It's not hierarchical. It's not a few people that are holding all the power. It's really about disseminating power and disseminating the tools for healing so that people can heal them.
Families maybe not being ready to talk. What role does storytelling and narrative play in healing?
A huge one. I think, trauma is stored in your nervous system, and your sympathetic, your parasympathetic nervous system can become activated. It's a integration of your mind, your body, your brain. We know that trauma impacts the survival systems in the amygdala and the brainstem, and people talk about experiencing like body memories. This could be tightness in your chest or pain, panic, or dissociation, but there may not be a clear narrative around that. And so exploring this through narrative family work can be really helpful, because it helps people understand what are certain words that we use to describe ourselves or to describe our families. Where did that come from?
Hmm.
And where can we move in these kind of problem saturated stories to find ways to reauthor our own narrative?
Hmm.
And how can we create healing? How can we shift, whether it's about, parent-child relationships or sibling relationships, or even our relationships with ourselves? What
Hmm.
are negative messages that maybe we internalized, and now this is how we speak to ourselves? How do we change that language? How do we create room for compassion, curiosity, and confidence? So, finding some of those responses that one has when you've experienced trauma, like the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, or understanding attachment styles. If you
Hmm.
are more securely attached or avoidantly attached, anxiously attached, or have disorganized, fearful attachment, how does that play a role? And having language around this can then help you
Hmm.
understand some of these narratives that are passed down.
Yeah.
And South Asian families, there's lots of stories about who we are, where we come from, where we belong, what is in a name, in our family name, because honor is very important. Giving face is very important. What will people say about you? That is very important. So it's tied to these, myths about this family, who we are. Sometimes it's about um, gender roles. There can be narratives about how women are
Hmm.
expected to behave or how men are expected to behave, and who gets to express anger and who doesn't, who gets to have emotional expression and who doesn't.
Hmm.
Question some of these rules or roles in our families, but when you start to look
Hmm.
at it, you can see, oh, here's maybe something that is not working for me. How do I change? How can I be different? And how will that be received in my family?
And how do people honor their history?
There's no one way to do this. I
Hmm.
personally am a big fan of letter writing, which is why I
Yeah, I love
tell
that.
folks to write letters to their ancestors, but also write letter to your future self.
Hmm.
What do you want your future self to say to you? What do you want to hear 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What do you think they would turn back and tell you about whatever problems or difficulties you're experiencing right now? And sometimes that can offer a lot of hope for people. Sometimes people are cut off from their families, and so they may not be able to say all these things. Can you put that in a letter? Or I even
Hmm.
have them do an empty chair exercise where I'll have them role play and
Hmm.
say, "Oh, imagine your parent sitting here. What do you want
Hmm.
them to know?" Practice saying it out loud, because they may have it in their head until they use the vocal cords to get the words outside.
Hmm.
That's really when something powerful can shift. And sometimes the letter into the sea or the forest and tie it to a balloon, let it float. I've created a lot of journaling prompts for folks who are interested in exploring some of this and want to find ways of healing. So my journaling prompts allow you to not only uncover things that have been passed down in terms of trauma, but also what's been passed down in terms of resiliency and strength. We have some, badass grandmas in the South Asian community who have been really at the forefront of pulling families out of poverty and sacrificing and keeping people together. Um, let's honor their stories, let's honor their legacies, and recognize the sacrifices that they went through.
How does the legacy of partition show up differently for South Asians in the diaspora compared to those living in the subcontinent?
I think the partition for South Asians, generally speaking, it depends on where you were at the time, where your family was.
Yeah.
Some families were impacted, some families not so. But for my family, for example, my grandparents would talk about the double migration, right? Moving from India to Pakistan was one major migration that they did. But then the choice to leave Pakistan and come to the US, that was a choice that they made, right? And it wasn't something that prevented them from going back home. So it has a very different context to it. But it's along that same line of, we want to do good by our kids. We want a better future for them. And so how do we now navigate this whole new culture? In some ways, it's very hard to say which migration was harder. And my grandfather, who just passed this year at the age of 95, would say things like, coming to the US, the language was a barrier. The culture was a barrier. Moving from India to Pakistan, we didn't have those issues. We didn't have resources, and we didn't know, what was going to happen. And he was working 3 jobs trying to support his parents, friends, siblings, their children, the extended network. It's really fascinating to hear from the diaspora, folks who migrated to the UK or Canada, US, Australia, but those experiences were, some of the stories that I've collected for my book talk about immigration and identity and belonging, kind of connect. And I think a lot of South Asians feel more connected in the diaspora, whereas back home, it's very much like, you're Indian, you're Muslim, we don't talk to each other. When you are kind of forced to be lumped into one South Asian identity in a white majority context, you're going to have to put those differences aside. And some people do and some people don't. But I have seen people come together and say, my grandparents would flip out if they saw us talking, but here we are having meals together and sharing, and you kind of unlearn some of the toxic messages.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that sort of grouping. What kind of happens when the inherited trauma comes together with racism, Islamophobia, and colonial history?
Yeah, I think, if you use internal family systems, IFS talks about legacy burdens, and these are the burdens that are passed on in our families. Racism is one, patriarchy is another one, materialism is also one. And, I talk a lot about scarcity mindset in my book because that refers to the fear of, you're always going to prepare for the worst because everything can be taken away from you at any minute. So you never feel like you have enough. Racism, it's layered because there were a lot, like I said, different regions and kingdoms in South Asia. And so sometimes, 2 Punjabis from Pakistan and India may have more in common than 2 Indians who are Punjabi and from Kerala, for example, like the North-South. So where these divides, where these stereotypes come from is also important in unburdening ourselves from these legacies that we carry. Racism here in the US is certainly rampant. I have experienced myself both micro and macro aggressions. Things like being told to go back to where I come from, but also having my phones tapped and having the FBI show up at my door. And
Wow.
yeah, it's something that people face across the diaspora. Indians being called Paki in the UK, which is a slur, into the N-word. Or being told that our food smells funny, or being told that our hair looks different, or comments about our skin, or comments about our accents, and all of these things that, again, away at that sense of identity and belonging.
And do you notice generational differences in how people relate to this history?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks feel disconnected from the history. Some people, that disconnect from the history is a mirror of the disconnect from the family and feeling like they have to acculturate, right? And in doing so, they have to maybe assimilate. Folks who come here have also changed their names, changed their religions, changed their identities, right? In trying to fit in and belong. Other people who are curious and do feel connected to the past and want to know more. So you see the full range, I think. Certainly the folks I have talked to who have so generously shared their stories really are curious about their past and want to maintain that. And in some ways, especially with some of the immigrants that I've spoken to, there's this desire to reconnect and reclaim their culture, their language, their customs. They feel frustrated that their parents didn't invest in language classes or certain classes for them so that they could know, you know. So it's important, I think, maintain that and understand how do you straddle, you know, being bicultural when you're being brought up in a society that's different from the ones your parents come from. And this can be true for, you know, second generation, third generation folks as well.
And tell me more about how you went about researching your book and you know, how you're able to get folks to be willing to share these stories and have them published with, you know, silence and privacy being such a strong piece.
So that was a major concern. When I sent out my questionnaire, you know, I stated very clearly that all information would be de-identified. The stories that I'm using are sort of combinations of several stories. So I'm really doing all the things that I need to do to protect folks' identities. I share a lot of my own story as well and my grandparents' story. This is, you know, something that I spent time over the years. And then archival info, our history books, books on politics, memoirs, there's fictional narratives that people have written. You know, there has been work done in this area, not a lot, but some that has looked at the impact of intergenerational trauma that have, you know, managed to collect stories. In India, there's the Partition Museum that I would, again, love to go to one day if I ever get the chance. But they've done a marvelous job of preserving artifacts from that time. Folks have written books and talked to folks across the South Asian subcontinent, folks who've been willing to share their stories. So the 1947 archive is probably the most monumental. If anyone's interested, you can go to their website. On YouTube, they have videos where you can hear people share their story. And you can watch folks recount, you know, really important aspects of their journey as they cross the border, you know, folks who served in the military or folks who were doing, you know, nonprofit work and creating charities and philanthropies to help refugees that were coming in by the thousands.
That's awesome. What do you hope listeners, especially South Asian listeners, take away from understanding the partition through a psychological lens?
I just want them to know that there is language that we can use to talk about and uncover some of this in our own families. It's tricky sometimes because we feel shame when we talk about some of these issues in our family. We feel like we are being disloyal or betraying our family if we, you know, air out their dirty laundry. But that's what perpetuates stigma. And that is what keeps people from seeking help when they really need to, because the shame is so strong. You know, having done work with women who've suffered through domestic violence, women who've stayed in unhappy marriages because talking about it would bring shame to the family, or survivors of sexual abuse, survivors of emotional abuse, neglect, not wanting to put their parents or family members, caregivers in a bad light because there's that sense of filial piety that we have in our culture. So how do you talk about some of these very difficult, painful things without feeling like you're betraying your family, without feeling like you're bringing dishonor? And that's really something that happens in conversations with my South Asian folks that I work with, is how do we understand the massive weight of the phrase "kya kahenge," what will people say, that all of us grew up hearing over and over again. What will people say? And this is something that I really highlight in my book because I want people to understand that that phrase comes from someplace. It comes from a place of fear. Not just about what will people say, but what will people do? Will people come after our family? Will people not, help us get that job or help in that marriage proposal? Or what will happen to our future generations, right? All of these fears are kind of tied into and weaved into this messaging that we get around preserving the family name and the family honor.
And what gives you hope when you start seeing people engage with this history?
I think what gives me hope is when we talk about breaking these cycles and when we can say, okay, we do now have information. We have the literature that we can use and read. And that's why I didn't want my book to be an academic book. I want it to be a readable, accessible self-help guide.
Yeah.
Even if you never see a therapist or don't have access to one or can't afford one, here's something you can use to implement not only for your own well-being, but share it with your family. Talk to them about it, in which to be able to ask these questions. It gives you strategies for reparenting yourself, right? Getting the parenting that you didn't need, a tuning that you didn't get. So being able to identify what was toxic, what wasn't, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and how do I change that? How do I make sure that what I'm taking forward is the gift, and how do I unburden myself so I'm not bringing this weight and this baggage into my future relationships, whether it's with your romantic part, whether it's with your children, whether it's with your community, your friends, other people. So really learning how to break those cycles and doing it holistically, mind, body, soul. So what are maybe different practices that I can learn about to manage my symptoms of depression and anxiety? Yeah. Not just feeling like you have to fit this cookie cutter intervention all the time.
Before we close, is there anything about partition, trauma, or healing that feels especially important to say out loud?
I think I would say that generally speaking, when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, everyone has some form of intergenerational trauma in their family. But all of us have a history. Our ancestors may have migrated 80 years ago. They may have migrated hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. All of us have intergenerational trauma, and all of us have intergenerational resilience and strength as well. And talking about these patterns in our family is not about betraying them. It's actually, in my humble opinion, a way of loving them. It's a way to say that I can honor our history, the good, bad, and everything in between. And I don't have to divorce myself from it, but I also don't have to accept the things that have caused pain, hurt, and trauma.
Yeah. Where can listeners learn more about your work or continue these conversations responsibly?
I have a very active Insta. You can follow me at Dr. Ammara Khalid there, or you can read more about me on my website, riapsychologicalservices.com. This book will be out next year, which I'm really, really excited, and I would love for people to read it and give me feedback. I really hope more books will come out after this one that will allow people to share their stories, and we really do need to hear from folks that are in the subcontinent, that are in the diaspora. I'm hoping that the book will be translated so it's accessible to everyone. There's lots to look forward to.
Dr. Ammara, thanks for all the work you're doing to get these stories out there and educate us all on this history and hopefully bring some healing to these folks. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You can find us on Instagram and TikTok and subscribe to our YouTube page at Behaviour Speak. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.